A very good evening, dear aspirants. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 19th June 2025, and today we have some very important topics for the discussion. So, one by one, we'll try to discuss all these important topics in a very detailed manner. And all these topics have been taken from different newspapers, and these topics will also helpful for your prelims and mains examination as well. So without any further delay, let's get into the discussion and let's understand all these topics in a very detailed manner. And the first topic is about India and US relationship, and this article has been given in today's The Hindu newspaper. So in Gender Studies paper 2, particularly International Relations section, there are very often mains questions which are centered around United States. And if you are having political science and international relations as your optional, and this article is very important for your preparation. So therefore, let's try to understand the context of this article. The context is that in recent times, both India and US bilateral relations, so in fact they are being projected as a cornerstone of 21st century, particularly with respect to strategic convergence. When I say strategic convergence, both India and US have common interests and shared values. But in recent times, the relations between India and US have been witnessing a signs of drift. So therefore, we'll try to understand what are the reasons for the drift in the relations between India and US and how to address this particular problem as well. And in fact, the diplomatic postures from both India and Pakistan and India and United States, policy signals and even the institutional preferences from US have raised concerns in India in recent times. So if you carefully look at the diplomatic postures that have been adopted by the United States and its policy signals towards India and the institutional preferences, so all these factors from the US side have raised a lot of concerns for India regarding the overall sustainability of the mutual alignment and also the regional security dynamics in South Asia, particularly with respect to Pakistan, and even the economic cooperation which is also in question, and the technological exchange between India and US. So that is considered as a cornerstone of prolonged defense and security engagement between these two democracies. Now we'll understand what are the sources of friction between India and US relations. And in recent times, the recurrence of outdated India-Pakistan hyphenation, and in fact USA has followed a strategy called India and Pakistan hyphenation. So this is an outdated or old strategy of the United States that US has followed from several decades. However, this particular discourse of United States actually undermines India's long-standing efforts to de-link its global standing from the regional rivalries. So however, US has been continuously supporting Pakistan, and that is a cause of concern for India. So we all knew that Pakistan continuously supporting the cross-border terrorism, but US still values its relationship with Pakistan as a key player to combat terrorism within the region and beyond the region. So however, India has been time and again exposing Pakistan as a sponsor of terrorism, particularly cross-border terrorism. So it is unfortunate that USA has been recognizing Pakistan in its efforts to combat or counter terrorism. So that is against the interests of India as well as the region. And in fact, this approach of United States towards Pakistan is seen as a diplomatic regression, especially in the light of India's independent rise in global geopolitics. And in fact, in recent times, so if you look at evolution of India's foreign policy. So India follows a policy called strategic autonomy, and India has also evolved from non-alignment to multi-alignment. So India is ready for multiple alignments with number of other countries. So therefore, we can say that India has an independent foreign policy, and India is also growing independently in global geopolitics. However, so manufacturing, trade and commerce are other important pillars of a strong Indo and US collaboration. So during COVID-19 pandemic, US and other Western democracies have adopted a strategy called China Plus One strategy. So I hope you knew what is China Plus One strategy, because in our previous news analysis also we have discussed about China Plus One strategy. Now, in fact, because of low labor cost and fairly good amount of manufacturing infrastructure and a skilled workforce, majority of US companies and Western developed world companies, manufacturing companies, are located in China. And because of this, China has been able to export a lot of manufactured goods towards other countries, into other countries. And in fact, it is said that Chinese growth is considered as export-led growth, because China's growth mainly based on export-led growth, and that is heavily benefited from the globalization, right? So globalization has facilitated trade and commerce, and trade and commerce coupled with the export-led growth of China has resulted in a robust growth and development within China on almost all fronts. So therefore, after the COVID-19 pandemic, in order to ensure the supply chain resilience, what US and other countries have done is that they have adopted the China Plus One strategy. So as per this China Plus One strategy, the companies of US and other Western developed world, so they would shift out of China to other countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia. For example, India, an alternative destination for these companies to relocate themselves from China to India. So along with India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, so all these countries can be considered as potential alternatives. So this strategy is considered as China Plus One strategy. So India expected that through this China Plus One strategy, India will benefit, because the companies will establish their manufacturing units in India, and that will facilitate gainful employment opportunities for India's workforce, and India's growth would also be driven by exports. However, in recent times, India is getting mixed messages from US regarding support for India's manufacturing potential, and these factors have disrupted the confidence in the China Plus One strategy that has been earlier adopted. And in fact, in recent times, Donald Trump openly threatening Apple to refrain itself from establishing its manufacturing and assembling plant or unit in India. So therefore, US is also expressing caution towards companies expanding to India, because as part of China Plus One strategy, these companies viewed India as an alternative to China. So an alternative to China, right? So if they wanted to relocate out of China, so India is a suitable alternative for those companies. But in recent times, US is also expressing caution towards the companies expanding into India. So therefore, it actually contradicts the broader Indo-Pacific economic alignment objectives. And in fact, US itself has recognized India as a central role in its Indo-Pacific strategy, right? So India has a key role in US Indo-Pacific strategy. So therefore, whatever policy approach that US has been adopting. So that policy approach clearly contradicts its broader Indo-Pacific economic alignment objectives. So US wanted to bring all like-minded nations in the Indo-Pacific region against the assertiveness and aggressive attitude of China. But on the other hand, US itself acting against its broader Indo-Pacific economic alignment. And in fact, the political volatility in US, particularly with respect to the H-1B visas. So what are these H-1B visas? So H-1B visas are given to the skilled workforce by the US government. Right? And after Trump being elected as the president of United States of America, so there was a political volatility that has been existing, that has been centered around the H-1B visas. So therefore, it could actually threaten the foundational tech and innovation linkages that could drive the bilateral cooperation. And it is also said that India is one of the largest beneficiary of H-1B visa regime. So not just India, but even US is also benefiting from this H-1B visa regime, because US companies have the access to skilled workforce through the H-1B visa regime, and that will be considered as foundational to tech and innovation linkages and the bilateral cooperation between India and US. However, the policy unpredictability, particularly in US, undermines mobility of skilled professionals. Right? So skilled workforce mobility across the borders will benefit US, and it will also benefit India as well. But in India, it is actually viewed as a brain drain. Right? So therefore, the restrictions over issuing the H-1B visa regimes or any other restrictions on the mobility of the skilled professionals would severely disrupt the shared innovation ecosystems of both India and USA. Right? So these can be considered as major sources of friction between India and US. I hope you understood this. Next is, what are the structural and perpetual gaps which are existing? So we'll try to understand those gaps as well. Because in recent times, if you look at US diplomacy towards India, so not just towards India but towards other countries also, particularly in Europe, so we can define US diplomacy as a transactional diplomacy. So it's a give and take diplomacy. So therefore, this diplomacy actually contrasts with India's strategic culture. So we have a strategic culture, and our policy of non-alignment, our policy of Panchashil, strategic autonomy, is primarily derived from our policy of strategic culture. But nowadays, US has become completely transactional. Its diplomacy can be characterized as a transactional diplomacy. However, so if you carefully look at India's diplomacy, it is guided by a strategic culture, and this strategic culture mostly emphasizes on the long-term vision. For example, Indo-Pacific, a long-term vision, and India wanted partners who are reliable, who can be trusted. And as I have already told you, that India follows a policy of strategic autonomy. Now, I would like to explain what exactly is a policy of strategic autonomy. So strategic autonomy actually means that India follows a foreign policy which best suits to its interests. Right? And in this strategic autonomy, multi-alignment that India has identified as a policy, as a foreign policy to achieve its objectives. Right? So strategic autonomy, for example, if US says that India should not have better ties with the other country, no, it's actually in India's interest. For example, I would like to mention one example with respect to the strategic autonomy. Now, US and Russia are rivals. We all knew about that. And from Russia, India purchased S-400 missile defense system. So India purchased S-400 missile defense system from Russia, right? But US imposed a lot of pressure on, US put a lot of pressure on India that India should not buy S-400 from Russia. So if India purchases S-400 from Russia, US threatened India to impose sanctions under CAATSA. So what is a CAATSA? CAATSA is a legislation countering American adversaries through Sanctions Act, right? So, US can actually impose sanctions on India if India go ahead and purchase the S-400 missile defense system, right? So despite US put a lot of pressure on India go ahead and purchased S-400 missile defense system. And now this missile defense system has become a core during the Operation Sindoor, particularly with respect to India's missile defense system, right? So after that, India has never imposed, US has never imposed sanctions on India, even after India going ahead purchasing the S-400 missile defense system, right? So therefore, we can say that India just looked after its national interest, despite US putting pressure saying that don't purchase S-400 missile defense system. So this is the strategic autonomy. Now, what exactly is considered as a policy of multi-alignment? So when we talk about multi-alignment, so India can align with any number of countries as per its foreign policy goals, as per its objectives, right? So therefore, the strategic culture is emphasizing on long-term vision, strategic autonomy, and even the multi-alignment as well. So I hope you have understood this. India can align with China, Russia, and India can also align with US, and even India can align with number of countries within the Europe as well. However, so this divergence between US and India very often leading to the misaligned expectations, right? So I hope you have understood the divergence between US policy and India's policy, because what is US policy? US policy is transactional diplomacy, but India's policy is particularly guided by the strategic culture that emphasizes on long-term vision, strategic autonomy, and multi-alignment, and this divergence leads to the misaligned expectations. However, the parts of US security establishment, so they continue to overestimate Pakistan's role in regional counterterrorism. Now, one thing that we should understand, that US fought 20 years in Afghanistan against Taliban, against Al-Qaeda, against Taliban, right? So 20 years they fought against Al-Qaeda and Taliban, in Afghanistan, and US believed that Pakistan has helped them in their fight against global war on terrorism. But this is not true, because Pakistan itself supporting the terrorism, right? So Osama bin Laden was found in US, right? So he was found in US, and Osama bin Laden was the leader of Al-Qaeda. So that was the who was the mastermind of 9/11 World Trade Center attack against US, in which around 2,000 people were killed. So therefore, Pakistan always supported terrorism, and it continues to support terrorism now also, right? So that is evident from Pahalgam terror attack, and Pakistan has also been continuously supporting cross-border terrorism as well. But here, a US security establishment continues to believe that Pakistan will always support them in their war against terrorism. So that is why it is being said that US has overestimated Pakistan's role in countering regional terrorism. right? So despite the historical evidence of duplicity of efforts by the Pakistan, because Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan, and US also knew that Pakistan has been directly funding, supporting, harboring terrorist groups and individuals who are designated as terrorists by the United Nations and US itself, right? So, and in fact, this is also another friction point between India and US relations, right? So US must be clear. So if Pakistan has been sheltering, funding these terrorist organizations and individuals who have been designated as terrorists by the UN, so US must call out those terrorist groups. US must call out Pakistan as well to further strengthen India-US relations, right? Because terrorism is a main concern for India. And this institutional inertia, so that actually creates certain policy distortions, and these policy distortions would be ultimately considered detrimental to India's core security interests. However, India's principled stance with respect to non-alignment. So non-alignment was a foreign policy strategy that India has adopted during the time of Cold War, right? So Cold War was a period after the end of the Second World War and before the collapse of Soviet Union, and that particular period is considered as Cold War period. And during Cold War, India followed a policy called multi-alignment because the world was divided into two different blocks: the Eastern Bloc led by USSR, the Western Bloc led by USA, right? So therefore, all these third world countries and newly independent countries or decolonized countries have followed the policy of non-alignment. We don't align with any of these blocks or centers of power. That was non-alignment, right? And in fact, India also follows the policy of a sovereign decision making, which otherwise called as strategic autonomy, right? So this can also be called as strategic autonomy, right? So this at times misconstrued in Washington as inconsistency or hedging, and such interpretations ignore India's strategic clarity, which is rooted in civilizational as well as the constitutional ethos. And I hope it is clear for you. Now, what should be the strategy that India and US must chart out so that their bilateral relationship could further strengthen? Now, in this context, India needs to expand outreach in Washington through a robust engagement. So, in order to have a robust engagement, a series of things need to be done by India, right? So these engagement can be achieved by legislative bodies, strategic think tanks, and even the Indian diaspora, so that we can actually reinforce the long-term logic of partnership beyond the executive level diplomacy, beyond the transactional diplomacy. And India-US relationship should understand the strategic dimension, the long-term vision between these two countries, and shared interests as well. And in this context, there are other approaches also that have to be adopted to further strengthen India-US relations. Now, the other things including strengthening the regulatory frameworks. So whatever regulatory frameworks which are existing, so those regulatory frameworks must be strengthened, and we need to boost the infrastructure and enhancing the ease of doing business, and that will consolidate India's image as the most reliable investment and manufacturing hub aligned with India or Indo-Pacific economic priorities. Now here, as I have already told you about China plus one strategy, right? China plus one strategy. So as part of the China plus one strategy, so India should be ready as an alternative, as a potential alternative to China. if companies wanted to relocate their manufacturing bases out of China to India, so India must work on improving ease of doing business. India must boost its existing infrastructure, and India should also strengthen the regulatory frameworks so that India can actually build an image as a reliable investment and manufacturing hub which is aligned with the Indo-Pacific economic priorities. And instead of viewing the skilled migration as a concession, right? So in this context, US consider a skilled migration or skilled workforce as a concession. Both India and US should position it as a mutually beneficial pillar, right? So both India and US should think that it is a mutually beneficial pillar supporting technological innovation, entrepreneurship, and co-creation of the frontier industries as well. So all these things must be done to further strengthen India and US relations. I hope you have understood this. And the next topic that we are going to discuss is about India and Canada relations and a possible reset in India and Canada relations, because in recent times what happened was the Khalistani issue, a bone of contention between India and Canada, and a Sikh separatist leader, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, was also killed in Canada, and it is also said that the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar also traced back to India, right? So all these concerns have led to a diplomatic row, expelling ambassadors or the diplomatic staff in both countries. So all these factors have led to sliding down of India and Canada relations. But we all knew that recently G7 summit held in Canada, and Canada has invited Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi as a guest to attend the G7 meeting, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi also attended the G7 meeting and discussed India-Canada relations as well. So therefore, in this context, we can see a possible reset in India-Canada relations, and that will result in signing a comprehensive economic partnership agreement and further strengthening each other's bilateral relations, trade, commerce, security, defense, Indo-Pacific, and even remittances, mobility of skilled workforce. So all these factors are the key factors that have to be considered between India and Canada, right? So in this context, so we'll try to understand the context in which this has been given. The context is that both India and Canada, so they have agreed to resume the diplomatic engagement by restoring the presence of high commissioners in each other's capitals following a bilateral meeting that was held between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on the sidelines of the G7 summit. So as I've already told you that earlier the diplomatic staff or high commissioners were expelled by both the countries, but recently these two countries have agreed to resume their diplomatic engagement by restoring the presence of high commissioners, and therefore this actually marks a diplomatic thaw after a strained relations between both India and Canada after Hardeep Singh Nijjar's episode in 2023. So he is a Sikh extremist separatist leader, and he was killed in Canada, and after that the India and Canada relations started coming down. Now we'll understand India-Canada relations in an in-depth manner so that you'll get an idea. So what was the status of India and Canada relations, and what is the potential of India-Canada relations? So all these things we will understand gradually. Now the diplomatic relations, so they have established the diplomatic relations after independence, so based on a shared democratic and the pluralistic values, because both India and Canada are democracies. Here India is the largest democracy in the world, and both India and Canada believe in pluralistic values as well. However, so there are some issues which are existing between India and Canada. One is Kashmir plebiscite issue and Canada's opposition to India's nuclear tests that were conducted in 1974 and 1998, and the Khalistani separatist movement. So these issues between India and Canada are a bone of contention because India believes Punjab is an internal part of India and will remain an internal part of India. However, countries like Australia, Canada and UK, so they host Sikh separatist leader, the extremist leaders, and these countries also openly support the activities against India by the Sikh separatists. So therefore this is an issue between India and Canada as well. And Canada's stand on Kashmir plebiscite is also an issue between India and Canada. And along with that, so Canada strongly condemned India's nuclear tests that were conducted in 1974 and 1998. Now in this context, we'll understand the diaspora politics and the Khalistani movement. Now, it is being said that Canada houses the largest Sikh diaspora outside India. So it would be around 8 lakh plus Sikh diaspora or 0.8 million Sikh diaspora. So largest outside India. And in fact, so Canada, support from fringe elements in Canada has led to tensions, particularly after Niger's incident in the year 2023. And there are some historical incidents also which are associated with Canada and these Khalistani extremist elements. So that was 1985 Air India bombing and 2018 a 12 controversy and 2023 G20 diplomatic cold shoulder. Right, so all these factors have led to going down the relations between India and Canada. So the nuclear cooperation agreement 2010, so that was signed between India and Canada, and this nuclear cooperation agreement between India and Canada has facilitated a Canadian uranium supply for India's civilian nuclear program, because Canada is a country which is also having largest reserves of uranium. So therefore this nuclear cooperation agreement 2010 facilitates Canadian uranium supply for India's civilian nuclear programs. And in fact, Canada also withdrew cooperation after 1974 Pokhran nuclear test. Canada resumed a cooperation with India only after Indo-US Civil Nuclear Agreement. Right, so Indo-US Civil Nuclear Agreement was signed in 2006. So Canada started cooperating with India after the Indo-US Civil Nuclear Agreement only. Now, if we specifically talk about the bilateral trade between India and Canada, so it is very less compared to the potential between these two countries. The bilateral trade in the year 2023 amounts to just $5 billion. Now, major Indian exports to Canada including pharmaceuticals and textiles, and major Canada's exports to India including lentils and wood pulp. Right, so these are the major exports of both India and Canada. And in fact, Canada also investing in India's infrastructure and technology. Now, Canadian pension funds, a major investor who is investing in Indian infrastructure and Indian technology. So the Canadian pension funds, so they have invested, so these companies from Canada have invested around $75 billion in India. Now, in fact, the trade agreement, which is comprehensive economic partnership agreement, so India is looking for a free trade agreement with both US and Canada, But because of the diplomatic relations or diplomatic tensions which are existing between India and Canada, the comprehensive economic partnership agreement negotiations have been stalled. Right? So because of the existing diplomatic tensions, these negotiations have already stalled, but India has been looking to take them forward so that the potential can be realized, so that the bilateral trade between India and Canada can be further enhanced. Now, when we talk about the people-to-people ties and education ties, as I have already told you, that the largest Sikh population outside India is hosted by Canada, and there are over 4,27,000 Indian students as of 2023, and in fact India being the top source of international students in Canada. Right? So in Canada, a total number of foreign students, India is the top source of almost all foreign students. And apart from that, Canada is also a top 10 sources of remittances coming to India as well. Right? So in this way also, Canada is important for India. Right? So India is also important for Canada. And Indian diaspora, there are around 1.6 million strong NRIs and persons of Indian origin. So they actively participate in Canadian politics, economy and diplomacy. Right? So therefore, there existing a strong people-to-people ties as well as the education ties between India and Canada, and it is very, very important to leverage the existing people-to-people ties and education ties between India and Canada. And the strategic cooperation, defense cooperation between India and Canada is also important to mention here, because Canada itself has its own Indo-Pacific strategy. And Canada has framed this Indo-Pacific strategy in the year 2022. And in the strategy, Canada named India a critical partner and a balancer of China's influence in the region and beyond the region. So therefore, Canada recognizes a central role that India plays in its Indo-Pacific strategy. Right? So these are the areas where the relations between India and Canada expands and focuses. So therefore, in this context, the G7 invite to Prime Minister Narendra Modi by Canada is a positive thing that has happened, and it is expected that the relations between India and Canada will improve. India and Canada would sign a free trade agreement, and they would work closely in number of areas, hoping that Canada will act against the Khalistani extremist groups which have been threatening India's sovereignty and territorial integrity sitting in Canada, and that is what India is wanted. So I hope you have understood this. And next important article is about the 16th Finance Commission and the concerns of the states with respect to the vertical devolution of funds and finances and increasing share of cesses to the central government that would reduce the total divisible pool of taxes between the center and states. So all these factors will try to understand in a very detailed manner in this particular article. Now, what is the context? The context is that the 16th Finance Commission has been facing increasing demands from number of states, almost all states, whether they are ruled by the BJP or any other political party. Right? So there have been increasing demands from most of the states to increase their share in the divisible tax pool from 41% to 50%. Now understand one thing, that what does it mean? So divisible pool of taxes from 41% to 50%. So I would like to explain you this with an example. For example, imagine that the total revenue of the central government, so the total revenue or tax revenue, non-tax revenue of the central government is 1 lakh crore. Rupees 1 lakh crore. So imagine this number. So out of 1 lakh crore, 41% has been recognized as the amount that should be given to the states. And who recommended this? So it was recommended by the 15th Finance Commission. So N.K. Singh was the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. And 1% of out of 1 lakh should be given to the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, and remaining money is with the central government. But now the states have been demanding that out of the total revenues of the central government, 50% should be given to the states, right? So however, there has been a declining actual transfers from center to states in recent times, right? So this is because of center's rising use of cess and surcharge. So here you have to understand one thing. The cess and surcharge is an additional levy apart from the taxes, and the cess and surcharge money will not be given to the states, and it will be ultimately with the central government. However, in recent times, there are claims that the central government has been increasing the amount of cess and surcharge, and this is not part of the divisible pool of taxes. So therefore, this ultimately reignited the debates of fiscal federalism, vertical horizontal devolution, and equitable revenue sharing models. Now, the vertical devolution challenge. Now here there are two types of devolution. So vertical devolution, so that means a center to states, center to all the states is considered as the vertical devolution, right? So all the states, state A, state B, state C, D, E, F, so all the states. So this is vertical devolution. Now what is a horizontal devolution? So within the states itself, not all states would get the equal amount of funds, right? So different states would get a different amount of funds based on the criteria that has been given by these finance commissions. So that devolution is known as horizontal devolution. So this is horizontal devolution and this is vertical devolution. So I hope you have understood this. Now, as I have already told you, the share of cess and surcharge has been increasing in recent times, and cess and surcharge will not be part of the divisible pool of taxes. Now, if you look at the increased amount of share and increased share of cess and surcharge, so center's gross tax revenues. So within the center's gross tax revenues, the total share of cess and surcharge increased from 12.8% in the financial year 2015-20 to around 18.5%. There is a clear increase in cess and surcharge, and thereby it reduces states' effective share from 35%. So this is like actual share or effective share reduced from 35% to 31%, despite a de jure of 41% recommendation by the 15th Finance Commission, right? So 15th Finance Commission has recommended 41%. So despite 41% recommendation, the effective share is only 31%. Right? So in fact, out of 28 states, 22 states across the political lines, whether it is a BJP ruled state or any other political party ruled state, so they have demanded that there should be an increase in the vertical devolution to 50%, right? So they have been demanding that the vertical devolution should be 50% of the total revenue, so that state governments would meet their expenditure obligations, right? Because they have cited the responsibilities that they have, the revenue constraints, particularly after introduction of the goods and services tax, and the limited fiscal autonomy that they have. because of all these concerns, they have been demanding that the divisible pool of taxes from center to states as part of the vertical devolution should be 50%. And union government actually cites increasing defense and capital expenditure. Central government actually says that there has been an increasing defense and capital expenditure, right? So these are the reasons to resist the higher devolution, right? So this is the reason why we are not able to devolve a higher amount of money to the state governments, because of our obligations to spend on defense and capital expenditure. However, with the commission's leadership hinting against a major upward revision, so there will be no major upward revisions due to a fiscal balancing concerns, right? Now, horizontal devolution inequalities. I have explained what exactly is a vertical devolution, but horizontal devolution concept also brought into effect, right? So here you can see that the criteria that has been given by the 15th Finance Commission for the devolution of funds to the various states, right? So in fact, if you carefully look at it, so income distance is given the highest proportion. So 45% of allocations should be based on income distance, and 10% is based on forest and ecology, demographic performance, right? So demographic performance is 12.5%, and apart from that, area 15%, population 15%, and tax effort 2.5%, right? So based on the criteria, the horizontal devolution would change from total allocation of funds would change from one state to another state, right? So horizontal devolution inequalities, right? So current horizontal devolution formula actually gives high weightage to population, right? So it actually gives a highest amount of devolution to population, and income distance also is taken into account, right? So income distance is having around 45%. So because of this income distance, poor states like Bihar, UP would get a higher amount of funds, and other states like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, they must be penalized based on this income criteria. And when we talk about the population, there are some southern states, so they have performed very well in terms of controlling the population. Now again, they will be penalized, and those states which have the higher fertility rate, those states which have a higher populations, so they would be incentivized through the criteria that has been announced by the 15th Finance Commission for the purpose of horizontal devolution. Now the progressive states, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, so these states are considered as the progressive states. So they perceive the current formula as discouraging good fiscal management and the developmental outcomes, so thereby undermining the principles of efficiency and the accountability. Now a reworked formula that incorporates fiscal effort, area, ecological sensitivity, and social indicators. So all these are factors. So there is a formula that is required, taking into account all these different indicators. Along with that, a need-based transfers can achieve equity without penalizing the governance performance of certain states. Now in this context, there are certain institutional and policy imperatives that have to be followed, because Finance Commission in this context must consider recommending a cap on cess and surcharges as a percentage of a gross tax revenue, and also suggest including the surplus collections in a divisible pool to ensure transparency as well. and a modest increase in the vertical devolution from the center to states from 41% existing to 45%. That would actually reflect cooperative federalism, and it would also address states' fiscal stress without compromising the national priorities as well. And in fact, the Finance Commission should also aim to strike a balance between macroeconomic stability and equity by ensuring its recommendations, incentives, revenue generation, efficiency, and interstate equity should be taken into consideration. Now here the vertical imbalance is a major problem, and in fact states total expenditure is 61% and states revenue is 38%. And the divisible pool of taxes are also reducing because of increasing share of cess and surcharge, and that is a key concern that states have been facing. And some other details on Finance Commission have been given, right? The 15th Finance Commission chairman is N.K. Singh, and 16th Finance Commission's chairman is Arvind Pangaria. And the Finance Commission is a constitutional body under Article 280 of the Indian Constitution, Part 12. And in fact, it is a quasi-judicial body having all the powers of a civil court. And the Finance Commission is constituted by the President of India once every 5 years. The members of the Finance Commission including a chairman and 4 members. Right? And in fact, the authority to decide disqualifications of the members and chairman is Parliament, and their tenure is specified by the President, and they are even eligible for the reappointment as well. So these factors are very, very important for the prelims examination, right? So in fact, so they have the powers of a civil court, as I have already told you, under the Code of Civil Procedure 1908. And the recommendations of the Finance Commission are only advisory and they are not binding on the government. And these are the important factors that would be taken by the Finance Commission before making recommendations to the President. So I hope you have understood this, and that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. So please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.